But tonight we're here to have a conversation with you about these political ideals, but against the background of one of the areas that means most to us as human beings, religious faith. I can think of no one better suited to moderate this interesting discussion than NPR host and executive editor of the New England News Collaborative, John Dankosky. Join me in welcoming John to the stage.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much. Thanks. I appreciate it. Hi, folks. I'm honored that you thought that somebody who spent 30 years talking to people on the radio would know anything about humility. We'll see how that goes tonight. This is a really fascinating topic, and as we were preparing for this, I can honestly say I'm as energized by this conversation as I have been in any of the various conversations I've had with the Connecticut Forum over the years. So thank you for inviting me. And I want to welcome on our panelists, because we've got a lot of your questions, and we've got a lot of other questions to ask them. So let me first welcome on David Gergen. He co-chaired with Madeleine Albright the Inclusive America Project at the Aspen Institute, which focused on enhancing religious pluralism. He's a professor of public service and co-director of the Center for Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School. He serves as a senior political analyst for CNN. He served as White House advisor to 4 U.S. presidents of both parties, Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and Clinton. Please welcome David Gergen.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Rabbi Melissa Weintraub is founding co-director of Resetting the Table, an organization dedicated to building meaningful dialogue and deliberation across political divides on Israel and the American Jewish community. She's co-founder and co-executive director of Encounter, which works to strengthen the capacity of the Jewish people to be agents of change in resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Please welcome Rabbi Melissa Weintraub. And Eboo Patel is founder of Interfaith Youth Core, which works to create an ecosystem of people and campuses designed to make interfaith cooperation the norm in America. He served on President Obama's inaugural Faith Council. He's a regular contributor to public conversation around religion in America and a frequent speaker on the topic of religious pluralism. Welcome, Eboo Patel. So we've all been thinking, of course, about what we just heard, that we're not supposed to mix religion and politics, and maybe we'll just start there. And I'll start with you, Melissa. I mean, what do you think of that basic idea of the idea that we shouldn't talk about religion, we shouldn't talk about politics and polite company, because that's just too difficult, it makes it too messy? When you hear that, what do you think?
Well, one of the things that we often say at Resetting the Table, which is the organization I direct, is that we're not very interested in politeness, actually. Because we can be perfectly polite, right? We can play nice and be thinking about other people as malicious, bigoted, delusional, dangerous, loony, but we just stop saying so out loud, right? So we want to get past what people are really thinking and get it all onto the table. We want to get to what really matters most to people, what's of ultimate concern to people, and have that be what we're talking about.
Do you have a hard time getting people to go there, though, to break out of that shell that you kind of protect yourself with that says, oh, I don't want to say that thing, even if that's what I'm feeling?
To get to the table or to say it once they're there?
Well, to say it once they're there. I mean, it takes both things, right? But to actually get them out of that shell.
Well, that's why we have 6-month facilitation trainings to do just that. But really, that is the point, is to excavate what matters most to people and follow it and bring it into the room. So that's how we design space and train our facilitators to make sure that we're going toward the heat and not away from it. We're actually leaning into the things that we're afraid to touch.
David, how does that strike you, this idea of mixing religion, politics, about talking openly about these very difficult issues that we find so, I don't know, intractable sometimes, so difficult to talk about in America?
Well, I think one of the things we need in the country right now in order to bridge various divides is more honest conversation. And Americans have traditionally been very moved and rooted in religion. You know, this has been in many ways the most religious country in the Western world, in terms of professions of faith, not in terms of people actually going to church. But I think more importantly,
that is a distinction, yes.
well, it is. See you at Easter. But more importantly, I think, you know, nations with the aspirations that we have usually have some moral core at the center of things. And the best leaders are those who represent that moral core, represent the values at that moral core. And I think that it's inextricably bound up in many people's minds with their religious faith. What their ethics and their morale, their sense of morality is often rooted in religion. And so, you know, I think the most important work we can do is bringing people of different faiths together, as Eboo does so successfully. And he's just a terrific American. I just can't tell you. I don't know Melissa, but Eboo has been one of my heroes in life for a long time.
So nice.
So
Clearly successful given where we're at, right?
You know, if we need to have conversations in our public discourse that are like conversations we have around our family dinner tables. You know, they're more honest, they're more interesting. Not every family dinner table, but you know, we're not. I guess it's been an interesting question. We had a pool about how many minutes would it be before someone says the word Trump. It's been like 2.5 minutes. But in any event, I do believe that it is healthy to have a more open conversation that go to the core values. And let us talk about them. I think we will discover over time that even if we have religious differences, we share many values.
Mm. But I think, Eboo, part of where that comes from in America, this idea that we're not supposed to talk about religion and politics, it goes back to a time at which, when we weren't supposed to talk about religion and politics, there were two maybe political poles, and there was maybe a couple dominant religions. And now we're talking about an American conversation that is much more multifaceted and much more difficult for a lot of people who come from, say, a predominantly Christian background in different parts of America to have. I mean, has that changed any in your mind, the idea that we do need to have this open conversation, but maybe people right now just aren't ready to have the open conversation that we probably need to have?
So I think the big question is, does religious language, so G.K. Chesterton, the great British writer, said America's a nation with the soul of a church, right? By which he meant that religious language is everywhere. And I think an interesting question is religious language going to continue to sacralize the tribal divides? Or are we going to be able to use religious language to do a rebinding, or to build a kind of a sacred canopy over a whole diverse democracy? America is literally unrecognizable without its religious communities and without the use of religious language. So at Harvard, David's Harvard colleague, Robert Putnam, writes a book in the 1990s called Bowling Alone, in which he points out that half of our civil society was started, generated, or run by religious communities. So our hospitals, our social service agencies, our private colleges, between a half and 2/3 of America's 1,400 private 4-year nonprofit colleges and universities were started by religious communities, 7 of the 8 Ivy League schools, for example. So it's unrecognizable without that, right? And it's unrecognizable without religious language, without Lincoln's better angels of our nature. We are an almost chosen people, again, also Lincoln, right? King's beloved community, Jane Addams' Cathedral of Humanity. In each of those cases, those leaders use religious language and symbols to build a sacred canopy over a whole. I think what we're seeing right now is what I'm calling the sacralization of tribes. So the fact that 81% of white evangelicals voted for Trump, there you go, David, 4 minutes in.
Yeah, that's
right. And Muslims have been wholly symbolically adopted by the progressive left even though an awful lot of traditional Islam fits very uncomfortably within that worldview, right? Muslims voted for George W. Bush over Al Gore by I think 11 points in 2000, right? But now the image of Muslims in this sacralized tribal divide is entirely the Shepard Fairey poster, young woman, American flag, hijab, resist. I think what we need is to reweave our civic fabric, and I think that an American way of doing that, it has a liberal use of religious language in a way that does not exclude non-religious people.
Do you have a thought about that, Melissa? I see you maybe grappling with what he's saying.
I'm grappling too much to verbalize my thoughts out loud in this audience.
Please try.
Well, the reweaving the social fabric, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about what it means to integrate religious language into that in a way that it integrates non-religious people. You know, one of the core parts of our work is emphasizing difference rather than commonality. It's actually, I think, a difference. Even on this, did my mic just go off?
I think we're not maybe hearing Rabbi Weintraub. Say some more to me.
Keep talking.
Oh, here, we'll hand you that microphone.
Okay.
This will be good.
All right, how's this?
Perfect.
Good. So one of the kind of core tenets of our work is that often when we try to subsume our differences within something that doesn't actually include us all, that people not only feel kind of coerced into that actually we need to engage, we need to go toward our differences, often not away from them, to discover shared interest and commonality and joint action. It's kind of paradoxical, and it's unexpected that when people are kind of compelled to set their differences aside or to subsume themselves within a fabric that doesn't in fact include them, that it gets in the way of their capacity to organically come to common ground that they would have come to on their own. I certainly I think the Establishment Clause and the wall between church and state is very deeply ingrained in me at the level of primal sensibilities. I grew up in the evangelical heartland, and my first models of activism were my father kind of sweeping into my elementary school to explain that singing songs about Christ our Savior was neither neutral nor inclusive. I know that's not at all what you mean, Eboo. and I know that the religious, when you say inclusive religious fabric or religious language, you're not talking about a particular specific religion, but rather, well, I want to hear more about what you mean. So maybe I'll pass it back to you.
So
Yeah.
we do a little back and forth.
Yeah.
Sure. When I read George Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, when Moses Sessions sends a letter to George Washington saying, congratulations on the new government and the ratification of the Constitution. By the way, what's going to happen to my people, right? We've been hated and hounded and harassed for centuries in Europe. What's going to happen to we Jews, of which there were 2,000 in the late 18th century in the new United States? And George Washington says, we will give to bigotry no sanction and persecution no assistance. May the children of the stock of Abraham sit in safety under their own vine and fig, and let there be none to make them afraid. I see myself in that. So George Washington is saying that to a Jewish leader in the late 18th century, right? And George Washington's language elsewhere is replete with Christian imagery, and it's not hard for me to see myself in his smiley Muslim, son of immigrants from India, in that, right? I think I'm saying a couple of things here. Number one, of all the identities that we talk about now, race, gender, class, ethnicity, nationality, sexuality, religion, the one that the founders got literally entirely right was religion. I mean, you could take what Thomas Jefferson said about religion in the late 18th century, and I would prefer that to an awful lot that's being said about religion now. So that's remarkable. Why would we lose that? Daniel Allen's word for this is patrimony, right? That is a gift, that language around religion and religious diversity that binds a people together is so precious at a moment of fracture. And I think that we should, I think a lot now about like political philosophers who basically thought that diverse democracies were impossible. So John Courtney Murray says, how much diversity can a democracy stand and how much unity does it need? And that used to be a theoretical question, and it's not anymore, right? If we are not able to articulate a common project for a diverse population, then what?
David, you wanted to jump in?
Well, yes, I do. Listen, I agree absolutely that language is essential, and care in language and respect for others through language is a critical part of this. But in our Aspen, when we had our Aspen gatherings and talked about religious pluralism, Eboo, I think you were the one who made a point that I found very striking, and that is that evidence shows that if you bring people together in a room to say we're going to talk about the differences in our religious beliefs, if you just start there, often the conversation turns worse, not better, and that they actually feel more alienated and more different from the person they're talking to. Whereas if you begin bringing the group in for a common project, if they spend a day or two, for example, building Habitat for Humanity kind of house, and they have a common experience together, then when they sit down, they're much more prepared to respect each other because they know more about each other. Something we've discovered in the military, and one of the reasons that I and a number of others are so strongly, in terms of dealing with these kind of issues, so strongly in favor of national service. And that is asking, creating an expectation, a culture that encourages people between 18 and 29 to give back at least a year to the country in some social, progressive way, possibly 2 years. You could have 1 year as a follower and next year as a leader. And what brought the country together very successfully in the New Deal was the Civilian Conservation Corps. It was something that Franklin Roosevelt proposed he was inaugurated in March of 1933. He proposed it that spring, and by that summer, the Congress actually worked well those days. By that summer, 250,000 young men were in the woods working together, and the CCC became an iconic program, most popular program of the New Deal. But it brought people together who had huge differences, just as the Second World War brought. When you had a Saltonstall in the Second World War saluting some Polish kid from Brooklyn, it brought people together. And so I think it is language. I think the language is very important. But we also have to have action that creates new environments for people to put down some of their differences.
I'm wondering if we can touch on the key themes that we were asked to explore tonight, this idea of conviction and humility, about balancing humility and the openness to the other and the other's ideas with the conviction that comes with your belief. I suppose we can start, Melissa, with the belief in a certain faith as opposed to starting with a belief that comes from some politics, and maybe we'll get to that in a moment. But how do you in your mind balance these ideas of, on one hand, conviction, a belief in something, and on the other hand, humility, the openness to believe in others?
I really appreciate the idea of Richard Mao, that we shouldn't actually set up a... Richard Mao is the dean of Fuller Theological Seminary and evangelical leader, and he talks about how we shouldn't actually set up a ping pong between humility and conviction, but rather we should talk about humble conviction, right? Really to see as a matter of religious fidelity, how we treat each other is every bit as important as the positions that we take. And there's tremendous intellectual resources in this regard, grounded in Jewish faith. I could give scores, but the idea that we should be epistemically humble is very grounded Jewishly. Every page of Jewish text is a negotiation, a great battle over policy and truth. And the idea is that is what will get us to the most effective decision making, that God's voice echoed at Mount Sinai and 70 contradictory voices proceeded, that we should study 49 arguments by which an argument is clean and 49 arguments by which the exact same argument is unclean, and then we should study the 49 concerns and experiences and values at the heart of our opponent's thinking, and only then will we have a full understanding of the law. There's kind of countless texts in this regard. So part of the way I answer your question is about a kind of commitment to a kind of convicted civility, right? A convicted humility that is grounded in a religious framework and a religious text.
In that it's truly such a mature, for lack of a better word that I can think of, way of thinking about it. But I mean, currently, Eboo, I think within politics certainly, but within just society, the idea of not expressing your full conviction for something is shown as a sign of weakness, that there is a weakness to giving an inch to the other. And that's something that seems to pervade an awful lot of society right now, don't you think?
Yeah, I feel like it does at the cable news level, but the only way you have, and this is, but the only way you have a Little League team is if a bunch of parents decide that they're gonna sponsor a Little League together, right? And there's a ton of compromise that you just do on a constant basis on who's going to use the fields and how long games are going to go and who's going to get to play. And the interesting thing for me in like being a part of this is some of this is enshrined in rules and a lot of it is not. A lot of it is just kind of this ethos back and forth. Like we got 15 kids in the team, and all 15 are going to play, right? And we're going to lose some games because of that. And there's no hard and fast rule, but this is just how we do things. And there's probably some parents who are 2 clicks, on this side of that, and some parents who are 2 clicks to this side of that, and you just make it. How else do you make a community work except unless you're willing to work together and kind of dance with each other a little bit? And my sense is that's the American genius at the level of civil society, and it still is. And the question is, how do you escalate that up to the level of political discourse?
And I certainly take your point that there is that constant battle happening at the cable news level, the 4 heads on the screen arguing with one another. But imagine if you lived in a world in which we were actually governed by someone who watched cable news all day long. I mean, getting it to move up to that level seems, I think, I'll ask you first, and I'd love your thoughts too on this, David, but it seems like an awful big pull. I mean, we have to a certain extent endorsed that politically through our actions, through our vote. We seem to like something about that way of governing and arguing.
So I think that, I mean, David's old colleague and boss, Bill Clinton, used to say, America will do the right thing after it's exhausted doing all the wrong things, right? And maybe this is my optimism showing, but I just think that, I mean, I don't know how else to say this, but when ugliness is so clearly on display, look at this and you're like, this is not the world I want to live in. And I just think and I don't like it. I don't like that attitude when I agree with what the person is saying. And I don't think I would have said that 2 years ago. Right? And I think that is how I have changed. That, there's the classic Jewish story of Rabbi Hillel and Shammai, with kind of a classic story. Melissa can say this in 6 languages probably, but a classic story of 2 great rabbis and their students who would argue with each other. And somebody says at one point, which argument is right? And there's the voice of God descends and says, both of these are true. Both of these are legit. But I would choose the school of Hillel because the people are nicer. Right? And niceness in a democracy is like William Carlos Williams' red wheelbarrow, right? So much depends on it, and you don't know how much you need it until it's absent.
David?
Listen, I think that the call, the hunger in populations for a leader of conviction depends a great deal on what the context may be that you find yourselves in. When you have a population that is anxious, that's fearful, that is not moored in values, that doesn't know where things are coming at, they feel a little afraid and anxious, they're more likely to turn to a strongman or someone who represents conviction. Whereas if the times are good and you're not threatened, you don't feel threatened, you may go to another way. To trivialize this, when Bob Dole ran against Bill Clinton, we knew from the beginning that Bob Dole was not going to win. But I will tell you, in the Cold War, had Clinton run against Dole, Dole would have won. And one of the ways we saw that was there was a question being put to the public. Okay, I'm going to name a political candidate. Tell me the first dog that comes to your mind when you heard that name. And when people heard Bob Dole, the number one thing that came to their mind was German Shepherd. When Bill Clinton, Cocker Spaniel. When you're in tough times, you want the German Shepherd, and when good times are rolling, I'll take the Cocker Spaniel. Thank you. But right now we're going through times that are fearful for many in many countries, and in country after country, the danger is that publics are turning to strongmen, that democracies, one after another, we're seeing toppled by elected democratic leaders who take their countries toward authoritarianism. And that's the danger we're facing here in this country now. Whether we could move in a more and there are already, if you look at the indices of when democracies move into authoritarian, it's when the leaders begin delegitimizing the institutions, say the Justice Department or the FBI or the CIA, when the leaders began attacking the legitimacy of the media so that they're no longer believed so that there's no set of common beliefs or set of common facts. It was Pat Moynihan a long time ago said, everyone is entitled to their own opinions, but no one is entitled to their own facts. And we're living now in a country which increasingly, you're entitled to make up whatever the hell you want to make up, and you call it your facts. And it's confusing to people, and it is really destabilizing. I think it's discrediting the press. And we also know that democracies turn toward authoritarianism when the political leaders begin to tip the system so that they stay in power or they enhance their power. And that's done through gerrymandering in this country. And we are gerrymandered just right up to our gills, and it's become, I think, a really negative part of our politics. So this whole notion of conviction, I do think, has to be seen in some context. There are times when you want conviction people. Margaret Thatcher was a conviction politician. Ronald Reagan was a conviction politician. You may disagree with their policies, but the publics of in those countries at the time like that, and they didn't break out of all the norms. They didn't attack all the institutions. They respected the written as well as the unwritten rules of democracy. But now we're seeing people come up who are much more like extremist demagogues who are coming up in our system and in overseas in particular. You can see it in a lot of countries in Europe now.
Can I jump in here
Absolutely,
without being
please.
called on? Okay.
Please. Whatever you want.
Okay, great. Okay. There's a couple things I want to throw into the mix, and one is that there's a tremendous amount of analysis and data collection around what happened in the past presidential election, and whether people were or weren't embracing, as you said, this model of the strong man. You said strong man. You said of certainty and a kind of bombastic spirit. We immersed for many weeks in areas of the country that went for Trump, including areas that flipped. Obama, Trump, and interviewed hundreds of people. And I want to bring this into the mix because there's a tremendous amount of projection that happens often in ways that we're not aware of. And we didn't hear from anyone that they were seeking authoritarianism or law and order. That doesn't mean that they weren't, right? People aren't always aware of their underlying motivations, but I think it's tremendously important to listen to people on their own terms, particularly in the fragmented and ideologically siloed world that we're living in. And so many people talked about grievance and disgruntlement and a sense of that their relationship to Trump's language was mostly one of repugnance and pulling the trigger reluctantly, but having a sense that he would bring a sledgehammer to Washington, that he was the anti-establishment candidate. I mean, there was a lot of variety, of course, among the hundreds of interviews. But I think it's essential to bring that into the mix, because I find in a lot of circles there's a lot of generalizations made about based on projections and assumptions of what kind of leadership people wanted when they voted him in, when they chose him as their leader. So that's one thing I wanted to throw in. Another thing I want to throw in is that political leaders are disincentivized from being humble in all kinds of ways, and we've named some of them. Gerrymandering and campaign finance is another lever. There's a lot of the role that money plays in politics, negative advertising. The way that primaries are structured is also something that disincentivizes political leaders from a kind of humble leadership rather than attacking others with whom they disagree. So there's all kinds of institutional reforms needed, but we've created a political system that doesn't reward leaders from being that which this panel is calling for.
Well, can I read something that you wrote back to you,
Sure.
having to do with the conversation that we're having around this? Because the research that you've done clearly dug up a lot of the truths of how people were feeling around that election. But one of the things we want to talk about tonight is the conversations that we can have in the wake of that. You wrote, "It's in liberals' interest not only to fight, protest, and condemn, but also to extend ourselves, to touch down in the middle of nowhere, to grapple with the sensibilities of, quote, flyover country. To pursue empathy is not to sing kumbaya, it is rather to overcome the objectification of people whose lived experience we need to understand to uncover our own blind spots and increase the likelihood that our arguments and challenges will land and be taken in. Whether we're drawn to the table for the sake of relationship, insight, or political expediency, heavenly argument means listening as a precondition for being heard." So it's a lovely thought, and it's something that I think we probably need to figure out how to bring to our overall political conversation more. I will say, though, living here in the liberal Northeast, the way that we grappled with that is I did a panel discussion about this issue with the Connecticut Forum not too long ago. We parachuted in reporters from Washington and New York to try to observe what people in West Virginia were thinking, and it didn't necessarily go that well. I'm wondering if you can expand on that, about that idea of, and I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on this, about expanding our own blind spots, about having that conversation with someone in this difficult time about these issues of conviction in politics.
You said many things. So the last part was about expanding our own blind spots. Yeah. I'm going to start with something you said in the beginning, actually. You read this back, and this was actually before we did the project that I was just describing. And one of our first days in Wisconsin and Iowa, my husband was sitting around a table with a bunch of evangelicals, and he said that he had taught at Wesleyan and, in the middle of nowhere, right, which is a phrase that's there, and kind of looked around, the middle of nowhere, Just even the language that we use, we don't realize the extent to which we've internalized language that is offensive to others because we don't have the empathy of what it's like to be them. And that for me, part of the confronting the blind spots is coming to see what it's like to be other people. Like Ira Glass has this beautiful teaching about how we can have mastered a lot of information and still deal with all the information and analysis we have in a really flawed way because we don't know what it's like to be other people. So we can have a lot of analysis and not know what it's like to be a soldier in Iraq, or a Sunni waking up hating the Shia, or a tear-gassed protester, or a soldier doing night arrests, or to bring it back to the U.S. context, what it's like to be a rural white person without a college degree listening to newscasters talking about rural white people without college degrees as if they don't count. What it's like to be a religiously conservative academic surrounded by people who talk about religious conservatives as if they're buffoons, right? Until we've heard that story that paints a picture of this is what it would be like to be that person, we often deal with information we've been given in a flawed way. So I think that we brought 36 people with us, our team, experienced often that we were drawn into a kind of empathic knowledge that changed our analysis. But it was really that empathy for what is it like to be other people that changed us.
Did you want to pick up on that? Because I'd love to know what you've learned about this. I mean, interfaith dialogue gets at so many of these issues. I mean, what can we learn through the work of interfaith dialogue about, I don't know, interpolitical dialogue in this country?
So I want to hew a little closer to what Melissa's saying, that because the way we think of interfaith dialogue at IFYC is not like Jews are here, Muslims are here, then they have masala tea, and then they're friends, right? We think in terms of like how, in what ways are religious communities partnering to strengthen social capital? Houston after Harvey, right? In what way is religious language being used to imbue tribal divides with a sense of sacredness, and what way is it being used to rebind, right? So I am especially interested in the kind of tribal divide that Melissa is talking about, and she's been much more scientific and rigorous about it. And I'm just gonna tell a story or two of kind of how I tripped across it, right? So in 2015, I'm all up in the Oscars So White movement. You all remember that, right? And like, this is personal for me, right? Like, I grew up like the only Indian on TV in the 80s is Eboo from The Simpsons, right? And it's kind of funny, but I gotta tell you something. When an episode of The Simpsons with Eboo aired on a Sunday night, school sucked for me Monday, right? It's funny now, I'm 42, I'm doing just fine. It's not funny when you're 12, okay? So like, I go to college and I get caught up in the diversity movement in the 90s, and one of the things that I kind of fixate on is Denzel Washington gets passed over for the Oscar for Malcolm X. I think it's 92 or 93. That's a crime. So I'm all up in Oscars So White in 2015. So guess what else happens in 2015? Angus Deaton and Ann Case at Princeton published the results of a study they do on middle-aged, working-class white folks in America. And the death rate in that subpopulation has spiked so dramatically, the only comparison is AIDS in the 80s. And so I'm literally looking at the New York Times one day, and I'm like looking at the Oscars So White story, right? This is not a small thing. I am not saying this to minimize it, right? I am saying that this is the world that I lived in. The most important thing was Oscars So White. And then I read this story, and I'm embarrassed to say this, but I don't know if I knew how to correctly pronounce the word opioid before that moment. And that didn't just happen. That's like 30 years in the making. And it just totally, whoosh, it's just not my world, right? I'm a brown guy with a PhD who runs a nonprofit in Chicago. This is my world, right? There's a great line by Susan Sontag at the Israel Prize or Jerusalem Prize address. Whatever is happening, there is always something else going on, right? And so, like, that was a moment for me, right? Yeah. So I'm gonna say one more thing. So I think it's also in that year that Thomas Frank's book Listen Liberal comes out. Anybody read that? So the overarching canopy of that book is basically, when did the Democratic Party stop becoming the party of the white factory guy in the middle of Ohio? And he's got a line in that, he's like, where is it, in what sacred scripture is it written that people who do well in school should rule societies? That's a really interesting insight. Because honestly, I just thought that was a given. Like, the dudes who ran the football team in high school also ran the high school, but their days were numbered. The guy who, went to Illinois on a scholarship and then got a Rhodes at Oxford, I'm the guy who inherits the world, right? And you know what? That's what's happened. And I have helped create a world in which my kids will inherit the next generation. So when my mom has a lung infection and the University of Chicago Hospital doesn't have a bed, you know what I do? I do what you do. I make a phone call. And my mom has a bed. Because I know doctors at the University of Chicago. I'm not a billionaire. My dad's not a bishop. But I went to Oxford. I know doctors. I have helped contribute to a world where people like me win. Why shouldn't other people be incensed by that?
David?
I think you do give yourself too little credit. You've earned a lot of things in life. Listen, I want to go back to a point Melissa was making. I'm really delighted that the University of Connecticut and these other organizations are sponsoring these programs because I do think we need to be listening to each other in different ways. But there's a lot of responsibility that should rest upon our major institutions of higher learning. And higher learning is under assault in this country today. There are a growing number of people who feel it's not living up to its responsibilities. And it's, many college campuses now are aflame with questions of diversity. And there have been legitimate, long-standing questions of diversity. How many women do we have on this faculty? Increasingly, if you go to any major institution, they say, where are the minorities on this faculty? Everybody who teaches me is a white male. So those diversity issues are pressing. But it's not just a diversity about gender and about race. There's a diversity, as Melissa was saying, about ideas. And having honest conversations in universities where people are exposed to a competition of ideas. And that's not been the case in recent years. The Boston Magazine had a cover piece about 6 months ago, and which some research I'd never seen before, that said if you look at colleges and universities across the country, the faculties are about 3-to-1 liberal to conservative, or Democrat to Republican. In California, it's about 6-to-1. In the Northeast, 27-to-1. That's an issue. And we ought to, if we're going to say we stand for serious crossing of the divides, then we need to deal with these questions straight up and with as aggressively as we pretend to be dealing with them. The conversations are great, but we also need action plans and strategies to deal with these questions.
What's a way, and I'd love to hear from both of you, what's a way to get at that? I mean, what's something you do to start to change that? Because it seems like a pretty enormous problem to overcome.
It's a very hard problem to overcome because faculties change slowly. Yeah. The people are hired, they get tenure, and they're not leaving till they're 105. I just read today people think they're going to be, the experts are saying, and within a few decades, people could live to be 150. Imagine what that's going to do to tenure. I think that we need, our students need to be exposed to more conservatives coming on campus as visitors, speakers, being among them, sharing ideas, because you can't change the faculty overnight. But I also think that it's important to be recruiting and looking for, just as we're looking for, as we should be looking for more women. We need more, we need more gender balance, and we need to be looking for more minorities on campuses. But the leadership of the country needs to reflect who the people of the country are, and that includes our politics, and that includes higher education.
Melissa? You'd want to jump in?
I had to jot things down because you were making me think about so many things. So pulling a theme from what each of you just said, there's been an emphasis in the last 30 years in liberal circles on diversity, but on particular kinds of diversity, particularly around gender and race and sexuality, and a neglect of other kinds of diversity, including viewpoint diversity. Right? You were talking about the heterodoxy of actual opinions and ideas, and including class and education access. And so there's been a real neglect of those kinds of differences. Jonathan Haidt, you were asking about prescriptions, has a project working on a heterodox academy that, in terms of taking on the academic world, that's not my project, but I think that that platform is going to be really interesting, one of the things that he points out, and there's been a lot of data collected about this as well, there is active discrimination in higher education admissions departments toward anyone who seems redneck, a little too Christian, a little too conservative, and that coming through in college essays. That's actually a turnoff to college admissions departments, which reinforces all of the divides of American society profoundly. There's been surveys done in sociology departments and psychology departments that have shown that discrimination toward conservatives is kind of the only discrimination that's embraced because they're the bad guys. And people are not always aware that they're doing this. I'm pushing here because I kind of want to invite this crowd to be thinking about these things. I think it's important. So yes, we need heterodoxy and viewpoint diversity in the academy, but also the students that are coming up through the system. I came to think a lot about national service this summer, actually, in this work, in part because we were talking to a lot of military people, and they were talking about the military as a great mixer of American society, a place that political and racial and religious divides were overcome. Right. And people had a sense of my life is in your hands, and therefore I'm committed to you, and we're under one flag for one country. But also because we were bringing all these undergrads from Oberlin and UC Berkeley and University of Chicago with us. And again, they were saying things like, I've spent my life reacting to stereotypes of the views I'm hearing, not to the views themselves, not to the human beings behind them. Like, I have never encountered the people who hold these views or the views themselves. Like, that's really a fundamental problem, and it's a way higher education has become intertwined with these divisions and reinforcing of them.
I wonder, and I want to get to some audience questions here in a moment. I wonder, though, Eboo, if we're at a point, though, where on a college campus or just in society in general, it's hard for people to go to the point where they want to hear from the actual person who has the views, if the views that they're espousing seem so repugnant or perhaps so difficult to stomach that the initial impulse, as Melissa started this paragraph with, it's the liberal interest not only to fight, protest, and condemn, but a lot of people think that the fight, the protest, the condemn is what we need to be doing right now in the face of so many of terrible things.
So, I think that this is one of the ways that religion plays a really a powerful role, especially through archetypes, because an awful lot of what inspiring religious leaders did was to stick their chin into a place where it was going to get smacked and to take the righteous road. Right? So the obvious examples, right, are kind of King and Gandhi, and basically to say, through my righteous example, we will maintain a posture of decorum and nonviolence in the face of Bull O'Connor's dogs, literally, right? And those kind of examples, and right now it is with the exceptions of the Charlottesvilles, it is rhetoric that might be sometimes somewhere between uncomfortable and really, really ugly and racist that you might be facing. But it's religious archetypes that highlight the great Edward Markham line, you drew a circle that drew me out, heretic rebel, a thing to flout, but love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle that drew you in. So I'll tell two quick stories about this, right? This isn't to say that non-religious people don't do this or can't do this. It's just that I think the most ready examples are religious examples, right? So King comes to Chicago in 1966, leads something called the Fair Housing March. 700 peaceful marchers, 5,000 people from those neighborhoods come outside to throw bottles and bricks and yell racial slurs, et cetera, et cetera. So King is surrounded by police. He gets hit in the head with the brick. He goes down on one knee, wipes the blood off, and keeps walking, right? And he escapes his police detail at one point, and he walks up to a group of 19-year-old young men who are spitting racist language and throwing bricks. And he says, "You're so smart and good looking. Why would you want to do this?" He wins, right? He wins, right? there's a great story that Sufi Muslims tell about Jesus. Jesus is in the marketplace, and people around are insulting him, and in return, he blesses them. And when he comes back to his disciples, they say, how can you bless people who insult you? And Jesus says, I give only what I carry in my purse. Right? And so I think that if you're going to be a bridge builder in this day and age, you know, the metaphor I've been using is I feel like I've wandered out of my urban, highly educated, multicultural, progressive bunker into a landscape, and I'm getting some perspective on my bunker, and I'm like trying to point sympathetically to other bunkers, right? And the word I hear from people in my bunker is traitor. Mm-hmm. And the word I hear from people in other bunkers is alien, right? And I just like 6 months in, I just realized I just got to live with that. Like, that's just the deal. That is going to be the deal for a little while, and I need to learn how to sacralize this position. And Melissa's been doing this for a good long time, right? So we're going to have a drink after this. I'm going to have a Muslim drink part of this, and I'm going to hear how she's been holding up. But there's a holiness in this. It's a Lincoln holiness, it's a Jane Addams holiness, it's a King holiness, it's a Prophet Muhammad holiness, it's a Jesus holiness, and you're just gonna have to like deal with traitor alien for a while.
There's so much to get to, and the folks in the audience gave us a lot of questions. So starting now, I'm going to pepper some of these in, and I want to send the first one to David here. For political figures that you've worked with, how does religion influence policy?
Well, it's easier to say how it influences behavior. And I do think that political figures I've known who have taken their religion or their spirituality seriously, I do think that has given them a sense of a higher calling, and religion has been anchoring for them. Their spirituality has been anchoring. So I don't, I'm very happy to have someone with religious beliefs, in a high office. I think there's some very positive things about that. Where I think it becomes much more problematic is when people try to impose their religious views on others, and that goes to the question of abortion and some similar issues, where I think we are going to live together a lot more peacefully if we sort of have a more live and let live quality, rather than we're going to impose on you our views one way or the other. Because I think that we ought to be we need to show a lot of restraint in how we legislate, how we lead. There are times when you can do things in politics that are permissible, but they're wrong. Mm-hmm. There are some things that are just illegal, but in many cases we have unwritten rules. And it does seem to me that in a society that is as complex as ours, I mean, we're the first global nation. We're the first nation that has people from all over the world who come to live here. And we're trying to do something now that's very difficult as we move toward a society in which whites who have been the dominant become the minority. We're going to become a multi-ethnic country, regardless. I'm not aware of any strongly multi-ethnic country that has survived as a democracy. Mm-hmm. It is hard work, it's challenging, and yet if you embrace it, it's wonderful. Diversity can be our friend. Clinton used to say, diversity must not be our enemy, diversity must be our friend. And our challenge is, how are we going to create a country that holds together with so many different strands? And that's going to require a certain kind of respect for, an empathy for, but also a sense of, I'm not going to try to impose on you my religious beliefs. Mm-hmm. I really think that that's important, to have a cohesive and a working democracy.
But to Eboo's earlier point, in your work, you can take the chance to say, I will put up with being traitor and alien because this is my work. The people, David, that you've worked with, politicians, to be called a traitor by their base, isn't just something they have to put up with. It's something that gets them kicked out of office potentially. I mean, is there a political problem with the way this all works that makes it
But if you know,
impossible for them to make that
Yeah,
make
but Harry
switch?
Truman used to say, if you can't stand the heat, stay out of the kitchen. You know, so it goes with the territory. People who run for office are asking us to entrust power to them. Power we may have, and we pass it to them. And we have a certain amount of, they have a certain accountability for that we ought to hold them to that standard. So, you know, this has been by nature a rambunctious society, a rambunctious democracy right from the beginning. You go back to the debates among the founders, and you find they were going after each other hammer and tong. We talk about, you know, in the run up to the Civil War, how, you know, the senator from Massachusetts was caned in Congress. That happened many times in Congress, that people were beating each other up. It's remarkable. But what has usually been the case is that at the end of the day, people have understood you can have your fights and you can knock each other around, but at the end of the day, you have to solve problems. And you've got to come together to do that. And that means you've got to retain a certain amount of respect for those people. And the problem we're facing today is that increasingly, people who were once our adversaries or our rivals are now looked upon as our enemies, our mortal enemies. And when you start treating people like your mortal enemy, you cannot compose your differences. And that's why I just think that the questions we're talking about tonight are going to become more serious over time, not less serious.
Melissa, I saw you writing things down. Do you want to jump in?
In her
Well,
head.
I was in conversation with Eboo in my mind a few moments ago, and now I'm in conversation with David. That's how it goes.
Oh.
Originally, I was thinking a lot about what you were saying, and thinking that I think it's important actually to give recognition to those who say that dialogue is navel-gazing irrelevance at best, and that at worst that it actually reinforces power asymmetries that can only be redressed through agitation and adversarialism. And I certainly make community with a lot of people who think that giving validation, that there is an element of what we do that gives validation to things that are repugnant, and that should only be fought and protested. And I think that it's important to give recognition to that perspective and to consider it. I also think it's important to recognize that a lot of people in this moment in time are being re-traumatized by things that are happening to them, that it's not fair to ask them, certainly as individuals, to build bridges with those that they do see, as doing them harm, right? Not just as ideological opponents, as people who have rival ideas, but as people who are actually causing them harm. So those are pieces of recognition I wanted to give. You gave beautiful religious examples of King, and we could throw Mandela into the mix. I'm sure all of us could rhapsodize about the examples of Mandela as a leader who studied Boer history, right? Who was able to speak in a language that said, even to those who had been his jailers, that I'm going to recognize your culture, your stories, your heritage, what's beautiful about you, and the spirit of there is nothing wrong with you that can't be fixed by what is right with you. Like that redemptive leadership is often much more transformative than that which castigates and chastises. But not it's not for everyone. That bridge building work isn't for everyone. It's something that I want to call people to, because I don't think that we're going to confront, insofar as there is bigotry and racism and all kinds of ills in our country, we're not going to correct them by calling out or even calling in, which have become the languages of the moment. There's so much shaming in those languages that keeps keeps our circles too small. And I think after the 2016 election, a lot of people kind of had there was this anti-structure moment where people recognized our circles were too small, and then it quickly faded, and everyone's circles got small again.
I want to address this next question to Eboo. You've given some great examples of how religion is able to bind us together. This question is, where do atheists fit into this conversation, or any conversation about interfaith dialogue? I suppose we can expand it beyond interfaith dialogue. I've got a few questions from atheists here. There's a large contingent of atheists.
Yeah. So, at Interfaith Youth Core, atheists, agnostics, spiritual seekers, secular folks who are generally speaking secular in the various shades in that circle, they have an equal seat at the table as everybody else does, right? And in fact, probably. I remember somebody at IFYC staff at a staff retreat was once like, we need to do better with secular humanists and atheists and agnostics. And I'm like, I wonder how many members of our staff would identify that way. So I'm like, will you raise your hand if you identify as secular humanist or atheist, agnostic? And 12 out of 35 hands went up. And I'm like, we've never had a Mormon on staff. I'm serious, right?
Yeah.
We've never had a Pentecostal on staff. So IFYC is a brand of interfaith organization that runs from 2 inches left of center, which would be me, kind of an Obama Clinton position, to 4 inches left of center, right? And that's where the conversation is. And what I am increasingly concerned about, and I think what this moment allows for, is a conversation between 2 or 3 inches left of center and 2 or 3 inches right of center, right? So that's that. I think that because the term interfaith does not explicitly name atheists, which I get, and it's a problem with the term. I think that's a totally legit question. The reality at an IFYC and a number of other progressively oriented interfaith efforts is, demographically speaking, it is not particularly a problem. The bigger problem that we face is the total lack of involvement of more conservative Muslims, Jews, Catholics, Baptists, Mormons, Pentecostals.
Yeah.
Either of you have a thought on that, of the role of atheists in this conversation, or?
I have a lot of thoughts about what Eboo just said. Can I respond to that instead?
Yeah.
I have thoughts about atheists too, but the piece that you just brought in about the difficulty of engaging co-religionists, more conservative co-religionists, is really, really important. So there's a couple things I want to respond to. It's in the bridge building ecosystem, people will often lament that they can't get conservatives to the table. Speaking of Jonathan Haidt, I heard him recently say, in every political bridge building space will be 80% liberal Democrats and 20% kind of elite moderate Republicans. Like this was a law of nature, but it's really it's pervasive. Like it's ubiquitous, and I think we have to make so much effort to insist that that's not the case. One of the questions that has kind of been percolating here is how do we make this work more impactful, more broadly than the dialogue subculture, right? And John Paul Lederach, who's an amazing practitioner of conflict intervention and theorist, talks about critical yeast often being more important than critical mass. And what he means by that is, it's often the smallest component that makes all the other ingredients rise. And we have too much effort to mobilize the like-minded and too little effort to bring strategically placed partners together across their differences. It's often the strange bedfellows in a context of protracted conflict that are really going to create the breakthroughs. We found in engaging conservatives and rural people and working class people who are never at the table and meeting them where they were, right? Walking into gun shops and hunting clubs and bars where we knew that they were going to frequent at what time of day, and building relationships, that we were able to build dialogue forums where there were more conservatives and more rural people, more working class people than there were liberals. And not only that, but they gave standing ovations at the end of the forums because they were so hungry to be there. They just had thought that going to such settings was going to mean being subjected to a firing squad and shamed. And so when they felt that they could actually show up and be all of who they were and not be called repugnant, then they clapped. They stood up and clapped. There was a hunger for this. So
I just want to super affirm this, right? I mean, like this is, so the classic Willie Sutton line, why do you rob banks? That's where the money is, right? So if you run a vegetarian restaurant, don't be surprised when meat eaters don't show up, right? So Melissa is really smart. She's like, I disagree with a bunch of people on guns. There's a red-blue divide in this country. Well, I'm gonna go to a gun shop. There's probably some people there I disagree with. Probably an interesting conversation to be had, right? So like it's what I love about that is like the simple, straightforward, no doneness, right? But frankly, there's not that many people I know who do it, right?
Eboo and I talked just briefly before we came out tonight, and both of us had recently picked up the same book in preparation for tonight. And so it's a book called Political Tribes, and it's by Amy Chu, who is at Yale. She's the Tiger Mom there, and it's a really wonderfully interesting book. Eboo's gotten a lot further through it than I have. But she makes the argument that it's not just a left-right divide anymore, that what's splitting apart the poor are issues of race, but what's splitting apart whites are issues of class. And that has been certainly true as income inequality has increased dramatically. And we increasingly have a white working class population that's under enormous pressure. Both, Eboo earlier was citing Robert Putnam, and he wrote a book about the white working class in his country. A conservative, Charles Murray, wrote a book about the white working class in his country. They both came to the same conclusion, and that was that the white working class in his country was really in extreme danger, that it used to be the folks that helped to keep our society glued together. They married and stayed married. They were churched, or they went to synagogues, but they were religious. Their kids went to school and usually stayed in school longer than the parents had. They were kids who went out and fought our wars in many cases. But this was a working class. In recent years, it's gone just the other way. Their divorce rates have skyrocketed. The children born out of wedlock have skyrocketed. The number of who stay in school has gone down. They're no longer churched. And by the way, they have an opioid crisis. And it's a group that's in real trouble. These were Democratic voters. They were on the left. They have moved over to Trump because he's a strong man who is offering solutions that we would look upon as illusory at best, but nonetheless, and promises that are illusory. But nonetheless, the class divide has gotten worse. And there is and she argues that if you really talk to people in the working class, they feel that in effect they've been robbed of their dignity by the upper class, that they're looked down upon. They're treated as second-class citizens. They're not being listened to. And that is a real issue that goes beyond left and right. It does go to class, and it does seem to me it introduces new questions that we haven't had to deal with until now.
Just quick. So anybody knows this? Then I got married pregnant, and man, that was all she wrote. And for my 18th birthday, I got a union card and a wedding coat. Anybody know that?
Yeah.
That's Springsteen.
It's Bruce Springsteen.
1980, The River. Okay? So that song was written as a lament. And think about how many people right now would do anything for a wedding coat on their 18th birthday and a union card and a 40-year guaranteed job, right? That song is written as here's how confining white working class factory life is, right? And that's now a dream. 40 years later, that's a dream. But we had a narrative in this country for that set of people. I went to school with a bunch of these folks, right? Graduate from high school, try not to get a girl pregnant, don't commit a felony, you'll be fine by the time you're 26. That's literally what their parents told them. I'm a brown guy, so my parents were like, if you don't get straight A's, you're gonna be a garbage man, right? That's the race distinction. And the funny thing is, like the economy turns in my favor. Mm-hmm. The economy turns in my favor, right? The story that their parents told them turns out it melted.
Yeah, and to really get out and experience the world and break out of that. What is it? The other song is it's a temple of losers when you're going out of here to win. You know, getting out on the road and seeing the world. And that's also something that's out of their grasp right now. What Melissa, do you think is the role of social media and the internet culture in the decline of intellectual humility?
Sounds like there's some audience members that want to answer that one. Well, you know, the pieces of this have been studied about the kind of online machinery of anger, the likelihood that people will retweet something that's angry. There's far greater likelihood that we will click, that we will engage, we will like, comment on angry posts. Joy is a distant second, it turns out, in the studies. So we're all actually reinforcing this. Of course, you know, there's the famous filter bubbles and ways that we get confirmation of what we already think, and social media is primed to position us to only take in that which the ideas and information that verifies what we think, and then we have the online disinhibition effect of what happens when we're not looking at someone's face, which is inherently on some level tempering us. And you know, there's a Jewish teaching that when I look into the face of another person, then I have to confront the limits of what I know. Because, you know, I look in your face and I bump up against my limits, right? The face is infinite. I look at your face, I know I'm not the edge of the world. Online, we don't encounter, you know, it's called Facebook, but we don't actually encounter anyone else's faces. You know, the question didn't ask about prescriptions, but I would call out to, you know, to push everyone or encourage everyone, invite everyone in the audience. Like, this is actually something that we can all do and counter the kind of deleterious effect of social media. It's actually very easy to get past one's filter bubble. I now get all kinds of notifications about evangelical Bible camps, advertisements for them, and I'm very proud of that fact, you know, and it didn't take much. It just took actually having an evangelical network and having them comment on things that I've posted, and me comment on things that they post, and now I get advertisements for evangelical Bible camps. Another like very easy but palpable thing that people can do, there's a whole bridge building ecosystem that is online, and given that you know the data shows that we are much more likely to retweet or to engage with or to like or comment on things that trigger our rage rather than our joy or inspiration, I encourage everyone to go and engage with the bridge building space in social media and really like it, comment it, connect to it. Eboo's Interfaith Youth Core's Facebook page and Resetting the Table's Facebook page, because bringing attention to the bridge building space and amplifying joy and inspiration and connection among people is one small thing that everyone can do.
Just to build on that briefly, for purposes of this conversation, I think the research that's particularly relevant is the degree to which serious engagement with social media as a child reduces the amount of empathy in that child. And if you're really going to help bridge building in the next generation, that's a serious problem, and we already have enough differences.
Eboo, do you have a thought on this? Right? No?
Social media is a cesspool on Mars. That's my thought.
So I knew someone would want to ask this question. I have an uncle who's very, very conservative and always wants to talk politics at Thanksgiving. These people only get together at Thanksgiving for some reason. It always ends in an argument. How do I engage in a way that is more productive, or should I just not talk about it? Okay, who wants to tackle the Thanksgiving conversation question? Or let's put outside Thanksgiving. It's a bit broader than that. I mean, hopefully you see your uncle more often than that. How do you engage? How do you have a conversation that's more productive?
I'll take it. The first thing that came to mind, I think it was Ron Heifetz, who you probably teach with, had a series of tips that he gave right after the election for how you talk to people with whom you disagree. And number one was, don't start with your family.
Yeah.
But in seriousness, I'll go back to a text that Eboo brought before about these two schools of Jewish thought that were duking it out for 3 years. And as you taught it, the school that won, that we said, we follow this school, we have to legislate as an operative necessity, we can't go both ways. So we embrace this school. Because they're nice, as you put it, right? But there's actually a series of verbs given to describe their conduct and their approach to argument, and I want to highlight one of those verbs because it's at the heart of what we see. It's really the basic building block of constructive conversation across disagreement, and that is the ability to reconstruct what actually matters to someone else in a way that's not caricatured or distortion. There's so much temptation to speak to the worst version of what others think, the demons of what they think, rather than the most sophisticated, eloquent, and generous version of what they think. And we have to work at it. I mean, this is actually a skill that we teach again and again. We've taught it probably to 16,000 people, on different sides of volatile issues, from guns to immigration to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, really working at building this muscle of being able to not acknowledge, I think you're right, but actually even understand what each other's talking about and demonstrate it. So it's conflict resolution 101, reflection mirroring, but it's actually incredibly hard to access when we need it most. And around the dinner table, if we really make the effort to understand what are the underlying motivations and sources of meaning for someone that we disagree with and show them we get it, we will often invite flexibility, receptivity, connection, recognition, all of the things that we're going for.
The first example, though, you gave is something that came up at dinner, and it comes up, I think, a lot for people who engage in interfaith dialogue. And my dinner companion said something like this, that it is easier sometimes to sit down with people of different faiths or different beliefs in a setting in which I know I have differences and I'm going to confront them in that way, versus sitting down with my family or people who are part of my tribe with whom I have some very specific differences. And do you think there's some truth to that we have a harder time having that conversation within our family, whatever the family is, because it's so close to us?
So in the world of interfaith engagement, right? The reason for this is that if your principal symbol is the cross and mine is the crescent, I recognize as a premise the difference in symbol and orientation. I know that exists, and now I'm able to listen to the meaning that you give to this symbol, knowing that I'm not going to agree with it, right? And that creates a certain space and climate. If we both orient around the crescent or the Quran, and you give it a meaning that I disagree with,
yes,
now we're in an argument. We're in an argument, right? And to begin by saying that this symbol, this crescent or this Quran, allows for multiple legitimate meanings, it sounds all intellectually nice, right? And by the way, I happen to hold to this. But then you have to justify why your particular meaning, why you hold to your particular meaning. You have to listen to other people tell you that your meaning isn't the best way of deriving meaning from this, et cetera, right? And when it comes to like something very basic, like having kids, right? So you know, I'm an Ismaili Muslim, it's a small Shia community of Islam. My wife is a Sunni Muslim. We're both politically and theologically liberal, right? We don't drink alcohol, we don't eat pork, etc. So when my kids run into a Muslim who prays 5 times a day, they're like, why don't we do that? And when they run into a Muslim that drinks alcohol, they're like, how come we don't do that? Right? So that's not something that they ask about Christians. They know we don't go to church, right? But when they run into a Muslim that does Muslim things differently, it implicates you in a much more personal way.
Can you apply that, I think, to the political world, David? I mean, there's some aspect of that that's true within the orthodoxy of the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, within conservative and liberal, in which there is fighting within those groups because specifically of that closeness or that sameness that we're talking about here in religion.
I don't quite understand the question.
Well, I wonder if we have more political fraction in part because it's not just a left and a right divide. There are great divisions now within a liberal or a progressive community. There's great divisions. Clearly, if you just look at the Republican Party, there's about 20 different things that you could say what a Republican is supposed to be. And it seems like that is in some ways similar to this religious example in which we are fighting with people who we basically agree with because we're not exactly sure what the orthodoxy should be of the party or of the belief.
Yeah, I think that's right. What's happening in politics is that both parties are fracturing within the parties. That first happened with the Republican Party as it drifted further and further to the right over the last 20 or 30 years. And you don't find many Republicans in Connecticut right now, right? It's not it's occasionally a Republican will get elected, but it's a much bluer state than it was. And now the same thing's happening with the Democratic Party. It hasn't gone as far out. It hasn't become as extreme, but the center hasn't held, and either party, and that's a real problem. If the Democrats could normally expect to win in 2020 in a presidential election, given what's been happening, if they've put up a candidate who represents the heart and soul of the party off to the Bernie Sanders wing, they could lose. Donald Trump could get reelected. I don't think it's a high possibility, but I think it's at least 20 to 25% chance. And so the parties have divided. But this business of having within families and the Thanksgiving question. Every family, almost every friend I have, including my own family, we've got this question. How to deal, there is someone in the family who either is quietly or publicly for Trump. And there are real differences in values. I find to some extent it depends on how different members of the family have wound up, where they find themselves on the scales that Eboo's been talking about. And it's the people who, the child or the brother or sister whose life isn't as smooth and is not as financially successful and so forth, and they've turned to Trump more easily. And I know everybody, I think a lot of people are struggling with this question because they care. I think we have to be very simple about this. I think we have to communicate very firmly to a family member, I don't care what you think, I still love you. You may need help as far as I'm concerned. But I still love you. And don't forget your sense of humor. Everybody can be self, if you make fun of yourself, it helps to make it easier on everybody. I just think it's got to be, there are some things that are more important than what your disagreements are. And family is one of them.
We have just a couple minutes left in our conversation. I'd love for you all to maybe leave our crowd with some hopefulness, it's always nice to end with that. And perhaps, David, I'll ask you to go first. Give us an example of something either that you're working on, someone who you believe shows some of these traits that we've been talking about in public life, or something that makes you feel hopeful that we're getting closer to the type of conversation or resolutions that we're aiming for tonight.
Let me just say that I have the privilege of working in a classroom with a lot of kids, and I see a lot of young people at different universities. And I'm, for all the problems we find with millennials, and there are some serious problems, especially with the working class, there are a group of people coming through the millennial population and a little younger that will knock your socks off and are really disgusted with the kind of politics we have, the kind of society we have, and are very determined to change it. And let me just say quickly, run off this. Look, I'm very encouraged by the Parkland kids. They represent something that is hope coming from a generation. And we had 7 of them come visit our campus, and I spent time with them about 3 weeks ago. And one of the things that I discovered about the high school, I kept on wondering, how do these kids turn out to be so idealistic, so fluent, but also to understand our political system as well. I mean, they were really, it's really very impressive. It turns out they have a great civics program in their high school.
Mm-hmm.
And too many of our high schools, we've sort of let that go by the board. They also have a good arts program. A number of their students are in drama and that sort of thing. So I'm very encouraged about that, the Parkland kids and what they represent. Secondly, I'm very encouraged about women and women coming off the sidelines to assert themselves. And I think we may have some real breakthroughs here in the years ahead. 2 years ago in the election cycle of 2016, there were about 1,000 women who called Emily's List to ask for help. Emily's List is a national organization that if you're a woman, you want to run for office, whether it be local, state, or national, you can come to them and you can get financial help. You get some helpful tips on how to get your campaign off the ground. You get some help in getting people who can run your campaigns and all that sort of thing. It's really helpful. So about 1,000 women called 2 years ago. In this election cycle so far, 34,000 women. That's true. That is going to change our politics. It really is it's one of the biggest things going on right now. But the last group I want to talk about briefly, because it goes back to the national service point and why Melissa and I and others are for national service. And that is, I've had the opportunity over the last several years to have a number of students come through our classrooms who are veterans, coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq, and peeling off their uniforms, and then deciding in their own minds, at some point I'm going to get into politics and help fix this country. They remind me very much of the World War II generation. And right now we have there are 150 veterans running for Congress this cycle, so twice what it was last time. And these are post 9/11 veterans, they're young veterans. And I'm very involved in trying to raise money and help get these young veterans elected on both sides of the aisle, because they have fought under the same flag, they've worked under the same flag, they are much more willing to work together in politics. They're much more bipartisan in nature. We're asking for oaths we're asking them to take a pledge, but we're out raising money. Conan Lamb just won in Pennsylvania. He won as a Democrat, took that seat unexpectedly because he was a young veteran who was business friendly, but he's a strong Democrat. And he won that unexpectedly. And you'll find a lot of the veterans are like that, but we're supporting people on both sides of the aisle. And the idea is, if you can create a working coalition in the center of politics, they could be the swing vote in the House. It's going to be hard, it'll take a while to get it done. But I'm just telling you, these veterans, men and women, Republican and Democratic, a lot of Democrats right now, represent real hope. And that joining with forces with women and others who are going to get elected, I think our politics could change. I'm increasingly, I'm a short-term pessimist. It's going to be hell getting there, but I'm a long-term optimist. I think the country is going to be in much better shape. The bottom line, help is on the way. Help is on the way.
Which is good, because we're all living to 150 now. Melissa, tell us something, leave us with something hopeful. What are some things you are hopeful about?
So what came to me when you asked the question is on a very, very different scale and actually much more micro than a lot of our work. But what came to me was a religious institution, a synagogue, that had been, speaking of intrafamilial disputes, been fighting a great deal and a tremendous amount of turmoil, fighting over a policy position that they were going to take, and constituencies were going to walk whichever way this went, right? Like if you go this way, we're walking. If you go this way, we're walking. And those people, and we can't even be a community to each other in joy or in sorrow anymore. And we did an extended process with them of dialogue and deliberation and input forms, and there are all kinds of different components. But one of the things that struck me in the surveys of people after this process, people were talking about various outcomes, greater buy-in into the decision-making process, and a feeling that they'd had voice and recognition in it, and so they trusted the outcomes and they could live with them. People were talking about expanding their thinking and even coming to change their minds about things. But the thing that's really stayed with me and that I think we need to restore in America, people described coming to see the pain and concerns of the people that they had dehumanized and dismissed. Just simply coming to see the pain and concerns of the people they had dehumanized and dismissed. And that just keeps coming back to me because I think it's what we've lost in America, and we have a lot of prescriptions for how to regain it. But one grand vision, which I'll throw out to the room in case someone can help us realize it, is to create the sitcom, the feature film that will do what a series of conflict transformation cultural productions did in Africa in the aftermath of civil war, where parties. There was a radio soap opera, for example, in Sierra Leone that 90% of the population ended up listening to in the aftermath of the Civil War that rendered everyone empathically. So you could kind of relate to all of the characters and you could see where they were coming from and where their dilemmas were. And this theme has come up a lot on this panel of the talent drain of depopulating rural America and factory towns. It came up so much in our work. I come from a town in Trump country, and I was one of the ones who was groomed to move away. And this is just such a dynamic in America today of the ones who move away and the ones who stay behind. So we need the sitcom that is going to bring all of America together and show how we actually do all love each other. And that even if we passionately disagree or find each other morally objectionable, that we're all relatable and reasonable on some level and complex humans with integrity.
Mm. Thank you. So, Eboo, how about you?
Yeah. So I'll tell a story from the tradition of Islam that has been especially important to me recently. So it's called the Hudaybiyah story. So this is in the year 629 or 630. The Prophet Muhammad has built a strong community in the city of Medina. He has fought 3 defensive battles against the Meccans who view the coming of Islam as a threat, largely to their business practices and also to their faith. And so, the Muslims are basically they're in a war situation. And one day the Prophet Muhammad wakes up and says, "We're going to Mecca, but we're not going as warriors. We're going as pilgrims." And so they wear the traditional clothes of the pilgrims who will go to circumambulate the Kaaba, 2 pieces of unspun white cloth. And it is part of the honor of the Meccans to protect anybody who is coming to circumambulate the Kaaba, which is the house that the Prophet Abraham and his son Ishmael builds. So basically the Prophet Muhammad has put the Meccans in a pickle, right? He's done a Jedi mind trick on them, because here's the people you're at war with showing up without weapons to be pilgrims, and it's your besa, is what Albanians would call it, your honor, your duty to protect the pilgrims. So the Prophet Muhammad and his companions kind of camp out at this little roundabout outside of the city of Mecca called Hudaybiyah. And the Meccans send one of their top generals, Abu Sufyan, if my memory serves me correctly, to basically say, "What the heck are you doing here? We're not letting you into Mecca." And the Prophet's companions say, "You're required to, that this is part of your duty." And the Prophet says, let's negotiate. So they negotiate a treaty called the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, which frankly gives away the store. The Prophet agrees to not enter Mecca and do the circumambulations. They agree to return and not come to Medina and not come back for an entire year. They agree to repatriate everybody from Mecca who is converted to Islam, who decides that they want their old life in Mecca back. They want to be with their family, et cetera, and they will not require reciprocity, and a set of other terms which are entirely in favor of the Meccans. And so, unsurprisingly, the Prophet's companions are angry, right? We come here, you tell us to drop our weapons, you tell us to come here as pilgrims, we come here, now we're not even gonna enter, and you've done a treaty that gives away the store. They're angry. Comes time to sign the treaty. Abu Sufyan looks at the treaty and says, "I'm not signing this." What? Well, it says Prophet Muhammad. And if I thought you were a prophet, we wouldn't be in war. Now the tensions are like here, right? Because here's a guy who's taken the store and is now being insolent. And the Prophet Muhammad looks at Ali and Umar, 2 of his closest companions, people who will follow as part of the Rashidun, the 4 rightly guided caliphs immediately after the Prophet. They rise up and they are ready to fight. And the Prophet says, "Sit down, strike the name Prophet from the document." and they literally cannot bring themselves to do it. They are physically incapable. This is their governor, this is their general, this is their commander, this is their prophet. They cannot strike the name prophet from the document. Prophet Muhammad is illiterate. He cannot read. He says, give me the pen, show me where it says prophet, and he strikes it himself. And they turn around and they go back. And they return to Mecca a year later, and Meccans by the hundreds and thousands enter Islam. Why? Because at the end of the day, people are attracted to generosity. They're attracted to magnanimity. And by taking away what in that moment is kind of a totem, even though it's definitional to the faith, La ilaha illallah Muhammad abduhu wa rasulullah, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is the servant and prophet of God. That is the definition of Islam. The Prophet Muhammad was willing temporarily to remove that in order to say, the totem is not what matters, the ethos is what matters. And you know what? He wins.
We left on a good note, right? Eboo Patel, Melissa Weintraub, David Gergen. A nice round of applause to these wonderful panelists.